Hey, Greg Palmer here. Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. We've got a good one for you. We're going to be talking about successful client onboarding and how to use the right metrics to take the guesswork out of the process. We've got a great group of panelists for you. I want to introduce them really quickly here and then turn it over to them so they can tell you a little bit about themselves. Joining us today, we have Chris Evenson of Nephilim. We have David Hanna of DGH Advisors. We have Rachel Lyubovitsky of Setuply and Josh Robinson of Checkmate HCM Solutions. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your schedules to be with us today. So as promised, let's go ahead and learn a little bit more about each of the folks that I just mentioned. So Josh, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Checkmate.
Sure, thanks. My name is Josh Robinson. I'm the president and owner of Checkmate HCM Solutions. We provide cloud-based workforce management technology and payroll services and tax filing solutions to customers throughout the country. One of our biggest obstacles on a regular basis is implementing new client accounts once sales closes a deal and getting them successfully handed off into the client service group, and then the ongoing perpetual cycle of client maintenance and additional services that happen after service takes over. So that is where my expertise really comes into play in regard to the client onboarding and the challenges that are presented by that. So.
Great. No, that's excellent. We were talking a little bit ahead of time. We're going to get into some of your experiences for sure. Rachel, how about yourself? Take a moment to introduce yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Rachel Lyubovitsky. I'm the CEO and chairwoman of Setuply, a client onboarding automation platform. I'm a serial B2B SaaS entrepreneur. I'm very passionate about leveraging technology innovations to make people's lives easier. After a career of creating software for a B2B sector, I realized that one of the hardest things about running software companies is implementing customers. So there's lots of learnings, and I look forward to talking to everybody about it.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. And then David, over to you.
Thank you. My name is David Hanna. I'm here in South Dakota on the Black Hills. And I, too, was a little bit like Josh. We resold the same platform in the human capital management space and did that for 14 years. Prior to that, I helped a group put together a hotel management company for a few years. Prior to that, I was a CPA for about 10 years. So I've been a user of software, implemented systems, processes, was a reseller, and now today I'm as I call a fractional CFO. I jokingly say I'm 5/16 of one, but so people get to use the things I've learned over the years in a fractional, less expensive way. And I've been really fortunate in helping a couple other B2B software plays here recently. So getting to see that development deployment side from that, from the reseller perspective and from the other, it's actually been wonderful for the things I've learned and hopefully been able to help them with.
Yeah, that's great. Now, 5/16 of a CFO. Now, that is diving hard into the CFO sense of humor right there. So
Yeah,
that tells you a little bit more than you maybe needed to know about David, but appreciate the insight. Okay, so last but certainly not least, we have Chris. Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Rick. My name is Chris Evenson with Nephilim Consulting. I'm in Heartland, Wisconsin. Nephilim is an independent human capital management onboarding, implementation, and training company. So that's really all we do is focus on implementations and client onboarding in that space. My background is in technology. I've also had quite a run with sales, so I can approach this both from a sales perspective on the importance of client onboarding and setting those expectations there, along with the operation standpoint as far as doing the actual production of onboarding.
Great. No, that's excellent. So now we're talking, as you already know, about the idea of onboarding clients. This is a really difficult area, and I think anybody in any space knows that customers are challenging sometimes, and certainly new customers are especially challenging. And I think there are a lot of potential pitfalls that can come from the fact if you are onboarding clients in a way that is not ultimately successful. This is a really painful situation because you something negative really quickly. And what we want to talk today specifically is about the metrics that you can use to make this onboarding process more systemizable, more successful, and ultimately easier for all parties involved. And so I want to start by just talking about these metrics in general and thinking about which of the metrics our panelists consider to be the most valuable, because I suspect that this is one of those really challenging pieces. How do I get the right information in order to understand where I'm succeeding and where I'm failing? So I'd like to start, Chris, with you and just talk about what metrics do you look at first and foremost when you're looking at how an onboarding process is going to determine if it's going well or not?
Sure. So I take it from a little bit front end standpoint where I'm often scoping the projects and providing estimates. And that is an important metrics for us to keep the timeline in track. So if I say 4% or five, let's say 5% of the onboarding or design and discovery, if we scope a project at, let's say, $100, and I say 5% should be design and discovery, and if we are past that, we know upfront and being proactive if we're going to still make that timeline happen. So keeping track of time and how important that is with labor costs as well is probably the single, from our perspective, the most important we can do to make sure we're providing an estimated and a scope based on what we provided up front.
Yeah, David, you want to chime in next and talk about it from your perspective a little bit too?
Yeah, when I was in the same space as Josh, I know has gotten more scientific than we did. I looked at it more from the accounting side, and I know Josh got in far deeper than that. But one of the things outside of just the accounting side, as Chris mentioned, on quantification of labor costs compared to how much are we getting paid to do that deployment or onboarding process, we always wanted to at least try to get a person's regular hourly rate because we knew we weren't going to make any money on it, but we at least wanted to get their base hourly rate out of it. And but beyond that, one of the things we found most captivating was when we started doing surveying of the customer 15 days, 30 days, 60 days into the implementation. And the more we did that, we started to accumulate better statistics. That was the last couple of years that we were in business, so we never got that deep into it. But I was starting to see some really good fruit come from that process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Josh, I think you were mentioned by name, so you're obligated now to respond. Let's go ahead and hear from your perspective as well.
Yes, it is something that we've, over the past few years, spent quite a bit of time pursuing automation around. In order to do that, you need to dissect, so many aspects of your processes. And as we've gone along that path, we've really refined the metrics, the scorecard that we use to track and to understand, what our situation is in any given moment. In this case, the idea behind the metrics or the scorecard at its core is that the scorecard should be designed to compel you to ask the right questions about what's going on in the inner workings of the organization, so that you are spending your time strategically where it needs to be, and you're ignoring the red herrings and the other distractions that are constantly in front of you. So for instance, we were just a moment ago talking about setup fees and and the cost of labor of implementation. And one of the things that the implementation team and myself were frustrated by, I don't know, it's probably 2 years ago, was the amount of our setup fees that are being waived in the proposal process. So we added to our scorecard the dollars of setup fees quoted and the dollars of setup fees waived, are using that as a way to compel our teams, to charge all of the fees that they should be, but also on the sales side to, document and, at a company-wide level, how much stuff we're giving away. Just to kind of, we're profitability focused company, so everybody understands, giving away revenue is, ultimately, if we can avoid it, we should. On the scorecard front, at a high level, again, to compel us to ask the right questions. So we have metrics on the scorecard to track our projects that are on track and off track percentage wise, which then of course compels the follow-up question of why are 19% of our projects off track, which we also have in a detailed section of our weekly update. The implementation weekly update is basically a page long email that's a spreadsheet populated from various sources, and then below that the detailed project by project notes of everything that we're working on. So we can always look at that detail when we want to ask the question of whether it's the client that's holding up or the reason why the project's off track, or it's internally, it's us. But you David, had mentioned, I think, at one point that you had somebody on your team implementing who became ill, and that kind of put you in a position where things got a little bit off track. Well, we recently have been in a identical scenario, and the manner in which we're tracking these projects has really put us in a position where our lead implementation person was on emergency medical leave, brought to the emergency room all of a sudden, and we didn't see him for 3 weeks, right before year end. And we also realized that there was a whole bunch of holes in our metrics, based on the absence of our lead person. But we have, similar to Chris, we've got projects that are the total portfolio projects are all of the projects, new clients, existing clients, that are in the pipeline. The active projects are those that have been started. Projects not started are, of course, projects not started. In that metric, if it's ever sitting above 10 for any significant amount of time, then we need to talk to Chris. Because
Josh, I'm gonna interrupt just for a second, because I think there's some really interesting pieces here that we're going to want to dive into a little bit more deeply, and I want to come to Rachel here in just a moment as well, because obviously Rachel, at Setuply, you guys have really done a lot to systemize this. But David, I just wanted to check in. It looked like you had something you might want to chime in here as well.
Yeah, Josh had mentioned you started tracking the amount that setup fees or onboarding costs, onboarding charges were discounted. One thing we realized is that you had to show that on the invoice that the customer saw as well.
Yeah.
Because if they don't see the discount, they don't think they got it, even though they did get it. But then plus on the accounting side, it gives you something to track and measure, so you know how much you are giving away. One thing we started doing a while back, within the last 5 years we were in business, so we tied an incentive program to the amount of setup fees and tried to balance that with net new revenue as well. Kind of a tough balancing act to make, but it certainly made people pay more attention to that, getting as much as you reasonably could.
I mean, when you give away that setup fee, because you pay the payroll cost and the benefits cost and all of the costs of labor, and you make no revenue.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So Rachel, I want to check in with you on this, because obviously this is what Setuply does. You have kind of systemized this process and really zeroed in on the metrics that you think are really important to track. Which metrics would you say are the ones that you really pay the closest attention to, or maybe that your customers pay the closest attention to?
Well, I think what's beautiful, going back to Josh's concept, is to systematize the metrics that are important to your business, systematize them in a kind of a scorecard, and keep a running track and make it easy to access that information. But some of the great ones are the backlog, the time between closing the deal and starting the project. If that backlog is too long, it means you probably don't have enough capacity on your implementation team to pick up those deals after the deal is sold, and customers are not going to wait around forever to get implemented. So backlog, project time span, so how long does it actually take from kickoff to completion? And Chris really goes into detail here, where you try to cost out every task that makes up the project, so you have a much more accurate prediction. So start with time span.
Because Chris actually expects to be profitable.
Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, right? Yes, and I know, just to kind of piggyback on where Rachel's going, is that I will stress how important that is to scope a project on the sales end, And in our world, in human capital management, how many states, how many unions, um, unions are a big one, right? Like if you have one union versus 8 unions, that can be a huge swing. And if that's not scoped up front and those expectations aren't set up front as far as time commitment, you can really get yourself behind and dig yourself a quick hole as far as what the time commitment is, the labor expense, and even from the client standpoint, projecting and giving them the right expectations, how much time they're going to be spending up front on this project. So that
Yeah, no,
scoping
this
up front is in our world we have a term. How do we actually a partner asked me how do we avoid the wash machine effect once we get into implementation, going around and around and around. Well, can it do this? Well, what if we wanted to do that? And that is all avoided by having that strict scope on what you said you want and what we are going to do.
Yeah, you touched on something that I think is really interesting, which we've sort of been approaching the conversation so far from this idea that, of course, this is something which you want to systemize. Of course, you want to have these metrics. I know from experience that anytime you're talking about this type of process, there are going to be people who are listening who kind of are like, I don't need this. What we have right now is just fine. The status quo is working for us. I think it'd be important to talk through some of those areas where you might feel like the status quo is working until all of a sudden it isn't, and some of those potential pain points that can come from this. And I know you all have some stories that you can share, some real world experience talking about why it's so important to pay attention and sort of what's at risk if you don't. Rachel, I'll start with you on this one. Obviously, you have customers who come to you with a need. What are you hearing from those customers about kind of where that need is coming from, or maybe the experiences that they're having before they're really tracking this process and paying attention to the metrics that matter?
I think one of the key areas for any business is growth, right? You really are focused on growing and building your business. And so if you're focused on sales, if you're focused on throughput, getting more customers in, it's it's only natural to think, how are you going to onboard them all? You can't use the same set of resources if you add 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 more salespeople and still rely on the same group of implementation resources. It's simply not going to work. And so that's one key area where metrics are very important. So you have to understand what your capacity is. They're not going to be able to implement any more than there's hours in a day. So you have to understand what the capacity is. That's where metrics come in, what they're capable of. If there are any seasonal effects, that's another thing that specifically in some industries, certain times of the year, there's higher level of activity. So if everything seems fine 3 quarters of the year, and then all of a sudden you need to triple your capacity, if you weren't tracking your metrics a year ago, you're going to be in a hot water. And then based on what both David and Josh mentioned about disaster, usually unfortunately happens when disaster strikes. You realize like, oh yeah, I should have been tracking, when unfortunately your capacity is suddenly diminishes, somebody leaves, somebody's out sick, and then you have even less resources to support new customers coming on board.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important piece to keep in mind is that, in many cases things can look just fine if you're not paying attention to the right metrics until all of a sudden they aren't, or you get to that time where there's a seasonal spike. And if you're in a situation where you're not able to operate effectively, this can be really detrimental. David, and I think Josh mentioned a little bit of the story that you were talking about before we actually pushed record here, but can you tell our listeners a little bit about your experience and sort of how you almost kind of fell into that pitfall?
Yeah, a little bit like Josh's scenario. This person was going through a really tough time in their life that none of us really ever want to walk through, but a lot of us end up doing. But it was about a 3 to 5 month window where their head just wasn't in the game, so to say. And it was one of our best performing people, brutally reliable, always got their work done. Customers loved them, coworkers loved them. They're really, really good. But they're going through that time where they weren't very good. And we relied on them continuing to behave the way they had when we should have trust but verify, applied that axiom to the situation, and we didn't. And thankfully, it didn't end up that bad. But it's one of those things where we started measuring more things and requiring more documentation of where a person was at. Like in Josh's scenario, suddenly somebody can't be there at the busiest time of year because of some catastrophic event. where'd they leave off? My days in public
Yeah.
accounting, when you were doing audit work, it was beat into you that you pretended like the world was going to end that night and somebody else had to do your job the next day. You always documented things with that focus in mind. And some people were better at it than I was. That's probably why I'm not in public accounting anymore. But it's a principle that carries over to very much the onboarding process. So you know where somebody can pick up for your work.
Yeah, and I
I
think
like
this
the
is one of those crucial pieces, the human side of it, right? Because if you don't have a system, if you're relying on human beings, humans can be excellent at times, but sometimes like life happens, to your point. It's not something that you expect. It's not something you want to have happen. Josh, it sounded like you wanted to chime in there as well.
Yeah, and I would actually say that, in my experience and based on, the recent experience we had here this past year end, um, it is not, when you have a rock star on your team who's a great implementer, and you don't have a system in place that allows that person's work to be picked up on by anyone else on the team, that might need to do it. That you're allowing somebody to carry so much weight on their shoulders. I think that it's kind of an irresponsible way to run a company. And what I mean by that is, we had our lead implementation person. I was guilty of this. We had our lead implementation person here this past December who all of a sudden went on emergency medical leave. And, in the middle of our busiest time of year, and we had to pick up the pieces where he left off. Now we do have, a lot of process automation in place, a lot of good process management, tracking of the projects and whatnot. But it brought out the holes. It demonstrated to us, for instance, we have steps in our defined process for implementing a payroll account, where it says to create the accrual policy and create the retirement profile and a couple of other things. And when I went to pick up the project for one of the bigger builds that needed to be picked up, I come to that step of the project, and the high level step, create profiles, is checked off, but the create retirement profile step is not checked off. What does that mean? I'm pretty sure these guys have a retirement plan. Why didn't we set up a retirement profile? So it makes you poke all the holes in it. And, like David was saying, redefine your process and make it better. But I think at the end of the day, having a templated process that you work from for every new client implementation is vitally important. Our mission right now for July 1st, on the implementation team, is to redefine our basic payroll build process so well, that anybody in our company can do it from start to finish and to have it tested. Simply because anybody that works for us, at the end of the day, they should be able to create earnings codes or deduction codes or some of the most basic components of setting up a payroll account. And if we have achieved that goal, then we know that there's nobody that will be carrying that weight on their shoulders, that they're the only one that knows how to do a thing to set up a new account.
Yeah, absolutely.
I,
That bottleneck. Oh, Rachel, go ahead.
yeah, I'd like to kind of piggyback a little bit of what Josh said about, a lot of what SaaS, B2B providers, technology providers, implementers do deals with very complex subject matter. In finance space, for example, KYC is an incredibly complex area, AML. And so, um, having and finding and training and retaining that knowledgeable staff is absolutely critical. It's one of the biggest challenges that companies have. And so, not being able to recognize when somebody needs training, when somebody is taking a little bit longer than others, and also by the same token, your star performers, something in the Chris's world, where if you're super fast, you'll just get more work, right? So being able to
Right.
metrics will help you recognize who needs to be recognized and who needs additional training, so you can continue improving your very knowledgeable resources.
Yeah, Chris, you probably have a really interesting perspective on this because you see this process a lot with a lot of different types of companies. What are some of the places where you've come in and just sort of had that, like, slapping the forehead moment, like, I can't believe you guys are doing it this way? I mean, are there some of the pieces that you can share? I mean, obviously, we don't need to publicly shame anybody here, but I think
Yeah.
this is one of those things that can be helpful because, there are really big picture mistakes that companies can be making. And again, it's a kind of common theme. You might not know you're making them. So I think it'd be really helpful for you to share some of those ones where, from your perspective, you're like, you got to stop doing this, guys.
Sure. Yeah, and I would say two things. I think I mentioned not scoping what the deliverables are on the front end. They're handing it over to the sales is handing it over to an implementation, and it's simply I got a deal, I got a contract, go implement this. And that implementation team is starting from scratch with zero scope to work from. So that'd be number one, something I've came across. The other one is, again, I think I mentioned, is tracking labor by project phases. So oftentimes if I quote an implementation and they're like, wow, I can't believe it takes that much. Well, that's coming from someone who has never actually tracked their time. And we tracked all of our time. We're all of our team is hourly, pay for performance based, and it's tracked by the phases from kickoff to design and discovery, build and configuration, testing and training, go live, and then transition and close out. And each phase allows you to align where that project is at. And not having that detailed hours allocation, really you're just shooting from the hip at that point on what a project may, or looking back to make adjustments if something is not aligned with what your scope was.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the first piece really quickly, just with a hopefully relatively simple question. But when is the right time to really start the onboarding process? When does it really begin? Because I think a lot of us probably experience this breakdown where you've got salespeople who are kind of out there promising one thing, and then you've got an operations team whose job is to deliver based on what the salespeople have sold. At what point in the process do you think is the right time to really engage and sort of considering, okay, this is now officially the start of the onboarding process?
My opinion would be the first phone call with the salesperson. That's where it starts, because the salesperson should be really treating themselves like a project manager, a pre-project manager of that project. And if they're not, they're doing their implementation team a disservice. So much data, and I can speak to both sides of this because I was one of those salespeople. So I go back and curse my old self now that I'm on the implementation side of this business. But on the sales side, we would collect so much information through just basic conversations, and the lack of note taking or documenting is really a shame that so much, so many conversations are being just left on the table and not being handed over. And I've seen some organizations do a really good job with, whether it's Excel or using a smart sheet or whatever tool, just a CRM system, wherever you can document. And that's really the key to everything, is just document, document, document.
Yeah. Any objections to that? Oh, yeah, David, or not objections necessarily, but you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah. No, well, it's nice that Chris admits that he's been on both sides of that fence. But because I've been mostly on the nerd side, not on the outgoing sales side. And so on that side of the fence, that disconnect between sales, operations, sales, deployment people, the best deployments I ever saw us have, and I've seen, and I've been a customer of a deployment, is when the salesperson and the people in charge of the onboarding process were in this conversation with me as a customer at the same time. And so we hope to uncover items, as Chris had mentioned, that you go through the scoping of it. We revisited that scoping during that conversation, as well as we talked about how that was going to play out during the deployment of whatever that system was. And this goes back to years back when I had other software outside the HCM world. But yeah, that communication disconnect between sales and onboarding, bridging that gap, there's all kinds of ways to do it. And I know the three other panelists here can speak to that better than I could.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're sort of transitioning now away from the discussion about what metrics are valuable and now into how do you actually
Yeah,
set up a
sorry.
system
Yep.
that will kind of allow you to first off understand what you know. You know, as Chris mentioned, you might have people on the team who know certain things because of conversations that they've had, and figuring out how do you kind of systemize that, make it so everybody knows how do you systemize these metrics and the process in general. Rachel, I'm sure that there's a lot that you could share with us on this topic of kind of creating a system that is effective. Do you want to go first here?
Sure. Um, yes, so exactly as Chris and David mentioned, you want to start thinking about the process the minute you pick up the phone to make that first sale, because you're going to have to implement them at some point. You will win and you will have to implement. And conceptually, it doesn't really matter what software, what solution offering you have. Typically, onboarding processes fall into basically defined phases, such as client engagement and exchange of the information, collecting the scope, getting any historical or configuration information from them, the actual implementation. So configuring the new software offering was the information that was provided by the client, and ultimately rollout, which may include testing, verification, any changes to clients' needs, um, making sure that the client starts using the adoption. One of the important metrics in the metrics world is percent completion, the churn, and a lot of that is attributed not even so much that onboarding has been successful, it's great. It's that the client actually failed to start using the product, fail to recognize the value of it. And so that has to be thought through throughout the implementation process. How you're going to bring that value, how they're going to start using, how you're going to train them. So it's not just the implementation process, it's making sure they bought into the new way of doing things and they're with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, I think you probably have some experience in this area as well. Anything that you would add or share?
Absolutely. Before I go into a couple of things on my side, piggybacking on what Rachel was just speaking to, not only, is it vitally important to manage it such that, you implement everything that the client decided to buy, but done well, you set them up to upsell, additional services or functionality in the future, or to accommodate by giving a customer centric focus around a specific need that came up that might not be a standard templated part of your build process, but it only takes 5 minutes to do it. So you go ahead and you put some icing on the cake. Um, but a couple of things that I think are really vitally important here in the you know sales handoff into implementation process, delivering everything that the customer has signed up for, is ultimately, once you have a system going, you need to constantly improve the system. It's the idea that you're going to have a system that is perfection, that does not need a constant attention, is crazy. You can't, it doesn't work that way. You set up a system and then you start to improve the system that you have set up. It also requires constant coaching. Every time you have these projects going on, and it's going to become regular that you have to have the same conversation, even with your rock stars, about the fact that they're not tracking their progress, or they're not, they're missing this one thing or this, repeatedly a couple of times. It's not necessarily in the nature of the people who have their, that are in the trenches cranking out the work, to always think about the system that they're operating in. They need somebody to remind them. And the last little thing I had, which was not directly related to this part of the conversation, but a little bit to earlier on, which is we have once had a process for our builds, which was, a checklist that had, I don't know, 20, 25 steps in it, for building a payroll account. And then there was a checkbox next to every checkbox for building that was for QCing. And so every step that got built conceivably got QC'd, which is it's from a systematic perspective, insanity. Because there's almost always a much more efficient and better way to QC the end result of the intricate work that's done, than actually checking every single thing that was built. For instance, in the payroll world, you QC the earnings and deductions by tying out historical payrolls to quarterly returns. You don't have to actually, one by one verify that the taxability of everything is what it should be.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point as well. I want to talk about, I think at this point in the conversation, we've probably spurred some of our listeners into thinking, I probably do need to take some action here. And typically when you get to that step of your thinking, the obvious question is, well, what's my first step? What's the first thing that I should do if I recognize that I maybe have a potential problem here? And Chris, I'll turn this one over to you. What's typically the first thing that you recommend to clients who are interested in making significant improvements in this area?
Sure. And I'll kind of keep on my theme as far as the scope, and a lot of feedback or pushback I've received is like, well, every client is so different. That's true. So start with a boilerplate template. If you had to implement the same client the same way every single day, what would that look like to you? And start there. So that might be like an 80-20 rule analogy as well. 80% of the time we can expect in our world, I'm going to speak our lingo. So 80% of the time we can expect to build 3 to 5 security profiles. We're going to expect to build 2 to 3 accrual profiles. And that's where you start. What is the 80-20 rule of your template? So you have a baseline, and then start applying your time and your scope on deliverables to that baseline. So it's like you kind of just mentioned, it's never going to be perfect. You're not going to have this end result that's going to be picture perfect. There's always going to be 80 or that 20% of adjustments and fixing and revisiting, but having that baseline to compare against is the best starting point.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Anybody have other thoughts that they want to share? Because I have a couple other questions, but I want to make sure we close off on this topic before we move on. David, go ahead.
Well, I had written this down before we even started today. Just a couple of sayings. Pete Drucker, the management guru, can't manage it if you don't measure it. And I think to what Chris was saying, you need to enter when you're developing that process, that system, keep reciting that mantra. That, all right, the reason I'm grinding through this fine detail is to understand exactly what step. Pretend you're explaining it to a 5-year-old. Okay, do this next, do this next. If you don't start out with that level of detail, you're going to have some very large gaps, and you're going to have to reinvent it. And reinventing it, rewriting things is even tougher than the first iteration. As Josh said, it's a never-ending process. But I think you got to start with that overriding mantra. The other part is, in the onboarding process, we used to always say we always wanted under promise and over deliver. We never wanted the other end of that, in over promising and under delivering, which is the whole disconnect between that happens at times between sales and onboarding. And Warren Buffett, one of his favorite things was, it takes a person 20 years to build a reputation, but it'll take you 5 minutes to destroy it. Mm-hmm. So the reason why you want a good process around this is to protect that reputation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to your point about setting expectations appropriately, I actually had last week an experience where I bought something from an online retailer. They said it'll be there in 2 days. And I was like, that's terrific. And then later on that night, I got an email saying, actually, it's going to be even faster than we thought. It's going to be there tomorrow. And my hopes came sky high. And then later on the next day, oh, actually, no, sorry, it's going to be 2 days again. And all of a sudden, what I had been happy about 24 hours earlier, I was a little bit grumpy about, because they had actually, they created this expectation. And it's a ridiculous thing. And I recognize how entitled that makes me sound, but I was fine with 2 days until they said maybe it could be there tomorrow. And then all of a sudden I had that in my head, this is what I want to do. This is what success looks like now. And then ultimately it didn't end up happening that way. So, no, I think it's a point well taken. Creating the right expectations is extremely important, obviously. And I think, if I can summarize, Chris, some of your points basically from the standpoint of, you just need to start. you need to kind of start paying attention. Even if it's not perfect, if you understand, there are going to be a lot of reasons why customers might deviate from this. Here is how we can at least get something on the paper. We can start to refine it, but really looking at that is going to be a really good way to just get going. And of course, anybody who's interested, there's a wealth of help on this panel right here, people who could potentially chime in and help make that process easier. I want to turn a slightly different direction now, because one of the other challenges which we talked about is there's a lot of other information that's out there which maybe isn't as relevant when you're thinking about the success of an onboarding relationship. There's a lot of noise, and how do you actually separate what you need to be paying attention to from what you don't need to be paying attention to? And I think this is going to be a really crucial piece as well, because again, you may be thinking I'm tracking the information, but it's the wrong information. It could do more harm than good. So I'd like to start by kind of talking through some of the potential piece of information that it's actually safe to ignore. Rachel, I'll turn this one over to you.
Totally. Yes, there are so many more metrics. It can get overwhelming. I think you, as Chris had mentioned, start with the big picture, your backlog, how much until you start getting implemented, your project time span, how long does every time you start, record that time, every time you end, record that time, debrief, debrief, debrief. So start with that, and then you can start get really granular. When you get the big picture together and it is systematic, then you can start granulating on, okay, this implementation process for this industry, for this size client, that ecosystem took this long, versus this other implementing rep worked on exactly the same size company, it took them longer. So then you can start getting deeper into details. I think a lot of companies sort of go straight for, oh, our churn is very high, what are we going to do? It's not always on onboarding could be a big reason to blame, but there could be many things in the process. So this is one of those things that looks very serious, but it could be confusing the signal. So start with big indicators and then get granular, and then you can start to understand after you survey customers, survey your team, what the reasons are for churn or other data points.
Yeah, any others that you think you can safely tell, for anybody else on the panel, that you can sort of safely tell people, this is actually not as important as it might seem. Pay attention to these other pieces instead.
I think that's why Josh mentioned earlier that some of your most expensive people are the ones doing the implementations, and they know what to prioritize and what not to.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to teach that in B2B SaaS, where, like Rachel said earlier, the setups can be so complex and there's so many pieces of data. That's a hard thing to teach people what to pay attention to and what not to. But I ended up I was too much of an accounting person, but I did a lot of this work myself with my own company. But you started to understand what's going to add value to the client, what isn't. And the stuff that wasn't going to add value to the client, you left alone, or you delayed it and said, no, that'll be important later, but let's do this now. And the person doing the onboarding has to have the moxie to be able to say that to a customer, because they're afraid they'll lose the customer if they make them mad.
Yeah.
And that's a really tough thing to train for people in that position. It's easier for an owner manager to do it than it is for a non-owner employee.
Yeah, no, totally.
And Greg, the analogy I like to use in our line of business is it's like building a house. You have to get the foundation right? You have to get the dimensions right. If a light fixture turns out not to be the right style that homeowner wants, okay, we can always swap that out. Let's not get hung up on that. But getting that foundation, getting the dimensions, getting the core fundamentals of what the scope and the project look like. So I'm always using analogies when I'm talking to people and teams, and because it just puts things in perspective sometimes, I think. So building a house, like building a custom house, is really a good analogy for what we do, and go through that process and what's important, what can be tabled, what can be revisited or swapped out at any time.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think the other question that I had, just kind of coming back to looking at people who are potentially listening here, potentially thinking about engaging, is there an ideal company size or company uh, status that you should be where you should really be thinking about this? You know, if you're a startup company, is it too soon to be thinking about this? Or if you're a large company, is it too late? Is there kind of an ideal time in a company's ecosystem for them to really engage with this process, or is it really just kind of anytime, whenever you have a customer, basically, you know, at any point in the process? Hopefully, you're getting customers throughout. So, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And Josh, I'll turn this one over to you first.
Sure. I would say that, if there isn't currently a process for onboarding new customers and tracking metrics around it, and you're in the B2B space, then now is the time, regardless of your age or size. I think that the older, larger organizations will have some form of a process probably in place, and sometimes affecting change in a situation where there's already a process in place can be harder than starting from nothing. I would say that if there isn't a process, then now is the time to get one.
Yeah, that was sort of the answer I was expecting. Any other perspectives on that, um, Rachel or David or Chris? David, go ahead.
I think you had said, what about the startup company, or when do you think you need an onboarding process that's documented and well thought out? You got to start somewhere. And so, as Josh said, even if you don't even have a customer, you're going, okay, I talked somebody into buying from me. Now what? Well, I'd better at least start with a list of 5 things, but plan on whatever you start with, that it's an ever living body of work, and you're always going to be working to change it and make it better. And sometimes you need some really focused effort at making them better, but you should always be considering making it better, even if it's small little pieces, and creating the document as such where other people can understand it, and it's easily retrievable, findable, and there's always a backup of it somewhere so somebody doesn't accidentally delete the darn thing. Whether
Sounds like
No,
that's
that's
happened,
never
David.
happened. No way. No way has that
You,
happened.
you want to talk about it?
no, it's okay. My counselor says I'm doing much better now. So that
Yeah. I suppose we should have covered that early off. Don't delete it once you have it, is maybe one of the early pieces of advice that we should have
well, you
made
never
sure
know.
to
Sometimes the
mention.
obvious does escape us.
That's right. No, it's true. I'm just conscious of the time, and I see we're coming up on the end of our session here, which is amazing. It's gone by really quickly. I wanted to just make sure that we save some time at the end to kind of zoom back out and look at this from a really big picture standpoint. I mean, we've talked about some of the important metrics that are really helpful. We've talked about kind of what can happen if you don't pay attention to the right metrics, some of the potential pitfalls that you can fall into. I'd like to end by just thinking in terms of advice that you would give to companies who are at the end of this conversation sort of recognizing there is something that we can do here. It does, and I think this is one of those things where to us, it all this kind of makes intuitive sense. You've worked with these processes, you understand these processes, but it can be a little bit daunting for somebody who is sitting there thinking like, man, this sounds like a lot of work. If we're going to really engage with this, we're going to have to roll up our sleeves. What advice do you have for anybody who's in that boat in terms of how to think about it, how you can sort of allot the appropriate amount of time to it, and how you can not get scared by the size of the task, because it can appear like a really big potential task. So I'm curious if there's anything that you could tell that could hopefully put people's minds at ease a little bit, make it seem a little bit more possible and maybe even easy to engage. And Rachel, I'll come to you first on this one.
Totally. As shocking as it may sound for somebody who represents a software company for client onboarding, if you don't have anything at all, start with a spreadsheet. Start with something. You need to get off some point and start tracking that process, because one of the other dimensions that we didn't talk about today is the client experience. That's probably when you should start thinking about professional software for that. But what is that experience like? What are they going through? Is it predictable? Is it consistent? Is it as amazing as it was during the sales process? If nothing else at all, giving them that same amazing experience and keeping them deeper engaged with your brand is ultimately what this is all about. Metrics is only helping you measure the effect of what you're doing. So start with something, keep it consistent, just like going to the gym or being on a diet. Um, Start small and keep those small little incremental changes until you're ready to get to the next point.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Josh, I'll come to you next.
Sure. I think I want to go back to kind of an idea I think Chris was expressing earlier, which is I'll phrase it a little bit differently though, which is, I think the real way to think about this is that it is possible to fit a square peg in a round hole. You just need the round hole to be a little bit bigger than the square peg. And the square peg is your, process. That's your standard 80-20 rule process that you define. And the gaps are where you add your bespoke customization and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting one as well. I'm gonna go now play with my little kid's toy toy box and see if I can get the round peg in the square hole. But not to distract from the topic at hand. David, I'll turn it over to you. Just some of the general advice for people looking to get started.
Pick a couple metrics, like Rachel said. How do you eat? Well, it goes to the adage: how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, and that is so brutally true. Pick that one thing. One thing I always watched when we did deployments was the customer logging into the system? Did they get their employees logging in? And so in leading up to this conversation, I was doing some reading on different ideas, literally searching the web to try to compress them here for our listeners. Well, one of the things talked about time to value. How long before your employees perceive, or excuse me, your customers perceive value, and dropping little value nuggets along the way. If you're in a complicated software and it's going to take a while to deliver that, and the client won't see their full value for a period of time, drop nuggets of value on purpose at key points to keep them engaged and keep them wanting what's next. You end up with a more satisfied client by the end of the whole thing, even though there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears along the trail.
Yeah. And then Chris, I'll let you bring it home.
Yeah, you bet. So we talked about all these ways and metrics to improve onboarding, and I would say follow up with ways to incentivize your team when these processes are put in place and they're working for them, and that you can celebrate that. My experience has been that most professionals don't like keeping a timesheet. I was one of them. I was horrible at it. But the reality is the most successful people in this world, your top attorneys, your top surgeons, they're documenting their time religiously, right? So to think that's like less than a professional standard or task is just not accurate, right? Like the most professional people are keeping track of their time, and it should be celebrated when it's done well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. And, my background is not really in this space at all, but I've really enjoyed getting to learn more from all of you. And I think the thing that really has struck me as a kind of recurring theme throughout the whole thing is the emphasis on understanding the human beings that you're engaging with, both on your own team, on the part of the customer side, making sure that you're incentivizing the right behavior on your own team, that you're providing an excellent customer experience on the part of the people who have decided to spend their money and time to engage with you. And if you're able to keep those pieces in mind as you undertake this process, I think you begin to see the value that comes from the process a lot more quickly. I think it also becomes a lot easier to sort of say, okay, I think here's how I can start to get into this. Now, we do have a couple of resources available for you if you're interested in learning more. You can check those out in the resources tab of this container that you're viewing this webinar in right now. So do take a look at some of those pieces. If you're interested in learning more beyond that, I would encourage you to reach out to any of our panelists here. You can find us all on LinkedIn to get some more information. Again, my name is Greg Palmer. It's been my pleasure hosting all of you today. On behalf of Chris, David, Josh, and Rachel, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.